When it comes to the career of Vladimir Putin, there is absolutely no event that has been more important when it comes to establishing his legacy and his position in the minds of the Russian people than the invasion and annexation of Crimea back in 2014. This was when Putin sent in his little green men to take over the peninsula from Ukraine, basically without a fight, at a time when the Ukrainian government was undergoing a period of transition, having just ousted their pro-Russian president, who actually fled to Russia into Putin's arms. And when it comes to the annexation of Crimea, it is hard to overstate the importance of this event in the minds of Russians today. And in fact, there was recently a survey of Russian citizens where they were asked what were the most important events in Russian history, and they listed Crimea as the third most important event, coming in right behind the victory of World War II and the Soviets' sending of the first astronaut into space. That being said, this poses a big problem, because for Ukraine, Crimea also plays a pivotal role in their national story as well. So much so that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, at the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, made a statement that the war began in Crimea and it would end in Crimea, implying that Ukraine would not consider the war finalized until they wrested the peninsula back from Russian hands. It seems to be an objective that neither side is willing to give up, and a lot of people have posed that Ukraine should simply be the one to concede here, for several reasons. First of all, because they can't possibly hope to militarily take the peninsula back, and second of all, because the objective is so important to Russian identity and also to Vladimir Putin's own career that Russia would simply never be willing to give it up, regardless of the cost. However, I don't think that's actually true at all. I've already made a previous video about Crimea and the military strategy that would actually be involved in taking the peninsula back from Russia, which, as it turns out, is a lot more realistic and achievable than the fake scenario that is often posed to show that it's impossible for Ukraine to retake Crimea. And to sum that strategy up, it basically comes down to the same factors that make Crimea difficult to assault also make Crimea almost impossible to defend under siege conditions. In this video, though, I want to take this a step further, going into a lot more specific details about how not only could Crimea be sieged, but to show how it already is being sieged. And on top of that, how this current siege shows that the Russian government is actually willing to give up the Crimean Peninsula if enough pressure is put on them, because in many ways, they already have. In fact, what I will show you in this video is that the Russian government has already admitted that they cannot defend Crimea from a Ukrainian siege. Not with their words, of course, but with something that is much more important: their actions, where in so many ways they have abandoned Crimea to siege by Ukraine, and the peninsula is simply waiting for the opportune time for Ukraine to actually come in and finish the job. The research and work behind today's episode was made possible by my sponsor, Incogni, who offers a very valuable service that helps address a problem we all face. If you ever Google yourself, you'll realize that it's actually quite easy for people you don't want to get access to your personal details. And often all someone needs to know is your name, city, and state to get access to your private information within minutes or even seconds, including sensitive details like your home address. Thankfully, Incogni can help by addressing one of the main reasons our data is so available all over the internet: data brokers, who collect and sell your personal details for a profit. Incogni makes it easy to remove your data from hundreds of these data broker sites. Then they monitor those sites to ensure that your data doesn't come back. All you have to do is sign up, give them permission to act on your behalf, and they will get right to work, finding your information, flagging it, and demanding that it be deleted. Now, the majority of websites can be caught by Incogni's automated removal service, but Incogni also recently released Incogni Unlimited to take things a step further. This gives you unlimited access to submit links to specific sites to Incogni's privacy experts for removal, with most websites being eligible. To try Incogni for yourself, just use the link in the description and my code Warburg to get a massive 60% discount off an annual plan. Now, back to the video. Really quickly, I want to clarify that when we talk about a siege of Crimea, we're not talking about a siege in the medieval style where you are trying to cut off an area from access to food and water and to basically starve both the military and the civilian population out. That is a war crime, and that is not what Ukraine is doing to Crimea, but rather they are making Crimea untenable to defend from a military standpoint by making it impossible for the Russian military to send in additional equipment to replace the equipment that Ukraine has actively been destroying. And this has been ongoing for a long time, so long that a lot of people have simply forgotten about it. In the early days of the war, of course, the siege of Crimea was one of the most important and strategic objectives that Ukraine was trying to accomplish. And it was so important, in fact, that I think a lot of people have missed that that siege was already largely completed, and very successfully so, with Ukraine now waiting until the time is right to achieve the later stages of the objective. Ukraine achieved a lot of things in Crimea early on that many people have forgotten. First and foremost, they of course forced the Russian Black Sea Fleet to relocate off the peninsula to other areas of the Black Sea that are not nearly as ideal for them to be located in, because they simply could not withstand the drone pressure from Ukraine and the long-range missile strikes from Ukraine that kept sinking the Black Sea Fleet. On top of all of that, Ukraine also had a very successful campaign of destroying the Russian air defense systems in and around Crimea, to such a successful degree that they were actually able to start sending long-range missiles all the way to the other side of the peninsula, striking ships and even hitting the Kerch Strait Bridge, which, if you remember from my previous video, is one of the only ways that Russia can actually supply Crimea. And a lot of people have said that Ukraine's strikes on the Kerch Strait Bridge were actually unsuccessful, but that's actually not true at all. Because what a lot of people don't realize is that after Ukraine's early successes sieging Crimea, Russia has ceased to be able to send military equipment over that bridge because they are simply too afraid that Ukraine will destroy the bridge while the military equipment is crossing it and basically take out a huge portion of their supplies for the front line. So instead of using Crimea as a way to supply their other frontline areas, they actually have to divert supplies from supply lines from other frontline areas down to Crimea through the land bridge because they are too afraid to use the Kerch Strait. What we see here is what I said at the beginning of the video, where Russia has not only proven that they are willing to abandon Crimea, but with their actions in a lot of ways that are extremely important, they have already done so. Russia is in a position where they are not able to defend Crimea from serious pressure right now, and the only thing defending Crimea from serious pressure is the fact that there are other occupied territories between Crimea and Ukrainian forces. But once that changes, the strategic picture will be very different. In a lot of ways, it can actually be seen that the current situation of Crimea is totally advantageous for Ukraine and not advantageous at all for Russia. Because for Russia, as long as these conditions exist, Crimea is a major draw on their resources, where Ukraine can continue to, over time, strike targets on Crimea that Russia replaces, robbing those resources from other areas of the front line where Ukrainian forces are actually engaging in combat. With this in mind, there are theories that I think we can give a lot of credit to, although we'll never actually know the strategic situation for sure, that Ukraine has actually to this point left the supply lines to Crimea open on purpose for a couple of different reasons. First and foremost, every piece of supplies that goes to Crimea is pulling away from the front lines, and it's helping Ukraine in their war of attrition, keeping those supplies away from areas that can actually strike Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian people. But secondly, Ukraine has done something very important, where they have shown in several different ways how they have the capability to strike the Kerch Strait Bridge. But to this point, critically, they haven't actually destroyed it. Now, some people will say, well, that's because they're not actually capable of destroying it, but there is another theory here. where Ukraine wants to signal that they are capable of destroying the bridge, but doesn't actually want to destroy it quite yet, to keep the supplies coming in, but also to keep a path open back to Russian territory for all of the Russians that currently live within Crimea. Of course, after Russia annexed Crimea, they moved a whole lot of Russian citizens onto the peninsula, Russian citizens that might want to leave if the pressure is getting ramped up, if Russia is in a scenario where they're actively losing the war and losing territory in other parts of Ukraine, and the siege of Crimea is ramping up. And in that scenario, the last thing Ukraine actually wants is to trap a bunch of Russians on the peninsula. What they actually want is to have an escape hatch to get those people to leave. And there's no surer way to get people to leave than for them to know that their time to leave might be limited. And I think this might be a large reason why for many years Ukraine has struck the Kerch Strait Bridge but has not destroyed it, so that they are sending a recurring signal to the Russian people on Crimea, leave now while you can, because eventually we can maroon you here and put you in a siege situation that you are not going to like. Now, there are historical examples of other forces doing this exact same thing. For example, back during Israel's war against Egypt, there is an example where people say that Israel actually went and dropped red paint on the dam that held back the Nile, but they didn't actually bomb the dam. And this was basically a way of Israel proving to Egypt that they could destroy the dam at any time, basically as a bargaining chip and as leverage and power. And whether or not that story is actually true, it shows that people have thought this way before in conflicts in the past enough to either do it or invent the story about it. And this shows that this could be a legitimate option for what Ukraine is doing. Now, all that being said, what is really interesting about this right now is that there are a lot of signs currently that Ukraine is seeking to ramp up the siege of Crimea. And whether they are actually actively preparing to do something more significant on the peninsula, or whether they're just trying to ramp up the siege pressures progressively over time, that remains to be seen. But a lot of things have happened. There have been a lot more ramped up strikes on the peninsula again, hitting things like helicopters and air defense systems. There's also been Ukraine taking out one of the commanders of the Black Sea Fleet very recently in what was obviously a targeted attack where they specifically wanted to take out this guy. And on top of that, Ukraine has been striking the railway infrastructure that supplies the troops on Crimea, as well as they recently did another strike on the Kerch Strait Bridge. So Ukraine is re-ramping up the old playbook to put the pressure back on the peninsula. This could be for a lot of reasons. Like I said, they could be sieging it actively. They could be just trying to put the pressure on over time. They could be just trying to have some level of strategic ambiguity because they're also striking a lot of other targets to make Russia spread themselves thin, thinking that they are trying to strike in multiple different directions, but not knowing exactly where they'll strike. And that does reveal another possible reason why Ukraine has not wanted to take Crimea totally yet. Because as long as Crimea is in the picture, not only does it suck resources, but Russia also has to consider it as a strategic target to be defended, and that draws resources and attention away from other areas of the battlefield. In either case, a couple of things are clear. Ukraine can siege Crimea, and not only can they, but they have already done so. Second, Russia is willing to abandon Crimea, and not only are they willing to do that, but they have already done so. It is obviously not a target that they are going to hold at whatever cost and that they are willing to spend unlimited resources on. And so, in every way possible, I hope this video and my last one on Crimea have dispelled the propaganda around Crimea and have helped you to see it as an actually tenable target for Ukraine. I don't think they'll take it back anytime soon, but I think when the time is right, they can and they will. As Zelensky has said, this war started in Crimea, and it will end in Crimea. And when it does, it will destroy whatever is left of Vladimir Putin's legacy. That outcome is not a foregone conclusion, but it is the most likely conclusion if the world continues to support Ukraine, continues to support their very good strategies that require patience and long-term thinking and planning, but that will work. So keep up the support for Ukraine, and let's keep watching them for as long as it takes. If you appreciated this video, I'd like to ask you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Other than that, a quick thank you to all of my YouTube channel members, my patrons, those who buy me coffees, and all the other ways you guys support me. I look forward to seeing all of you on the next video. Be sure to check out these two videos on screen.